Good evening. I think it's about time that we began. Um, the hall, I'm sorry to say, is rather sparsely filled this evening, but there are a great many people online, and I welcome all of you, as well as those folks who are here on the occasion. Um, the My name is Bob Hauser, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. So, uh, welcome to this public program of the Society. It is, if I may say so, bittersweet for me to offer this welcome because it is the last before my retirement at the end of the year. Actually, at the beginning of next year, for those of you who know about tax law. Welcome to the APS, whether you've joined us in Benjamin Franklin Hall or have tuned in virtually. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which time he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like the Constitution, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the Society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago, and it remains so today. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and the many other founding members, some of whom you would see if that screen were lifted, for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we're also much aware of their faults, most significantly, their slaveholding. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of their legacies while working towards a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. That's the APS idea. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing close to $2 million of research grants and fellowships each year, primarily to younger scholars and those in marginal appointments who need the support the most. And our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors across the globe. On the subject of support for younger scholars, I will add that I have been was thrilled to learn a couple of weeks ago at our most recent meeting that the Society has named a fund after me whose proceeds will be used quite specifically to support minority scholars, people of color, indigenous folks, and people with marginal academic appointments, like those even in community colleges, not universities or colleges as we understand them, to engage in research and to support and to attend meetings of the Society. And there is another similar fund, I think it's sort of similar, named in honor of our former Director of Meetings, Annie Westcott, who has joined us this evening. So we're on our way to doing more for those folks who are highly qualified but sort of on the fringes of the academic world at the moment. The Society sustains and informs citizenry. We do that through our meetings, publications, and exhibitions, influencing the influencers, and other outreach activities. Tonight's program, a lecture by Whitney Barlow Robles, will be introduced by Michelle McDonald, who is librarian of the APS and director of the APS Library and Museum. Dr. McDonald joined the APS staff just in January of 2024, and that was part-time until February. Previously, she was chair of the history program and professor of Atlantic history at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. In her 17 years at Stockton, she held several positions of responsibility, including interim provost, chief academic officer of their Atlantic City campus, vice provost, and associate vice president for academic affairs. Professor McDonald holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Michigan, where I do too, an M.A. in liberal arts from St. John's College, in Annapolis, which unfortunately I did not attend, and a master's in museum studies and American studies from George Washington University, and a bachelor's in history from UCLA. But before I welcome Dr. McDonald to the podium here to offer a formal introduction to Dr. Robles, I want to say a few words. I want to make two advertisements, if I may. The first one is for this book, which you're about to hear something about. And I've just started reading it, and I think it's spectacular. We are selling copies at the back for $20 a piece, which is a bargain price. And I will add, since I'm going to give you another advertisement for something that would benefit the society financially, I will tell you that I have been advised, I have good advice that that's exactly what those books cost us. So we're not benefiting financially at all. And Dr. Robles will also be available to sign the books after her talk in our question and answer thing. So why natural history? The American Philosophical Society gives a number of scientific prizes, and one of the biggest and best of those is something called the Magellanic Premium. It's named after a Britisher whose name was actually Magellan. He was not Fernando or whatever that, but his name was Fernando, and he endowed that prize with, I think, 200 guineas in 1798. And now I don't dare to tell you how much the prize is. Fortunately, we still have a tax system. But the bequest has an interesting twist. It is for outstanding accomplishments in science, natural history accepted. And I think that Mr. Magellan would have changed his mind if he had read this book. I'll leave it at that's advertisement number one. Advertisement number two, something else about the book. Dr. Robles really can turn a wonderful phrase, and the one that struck me in the introduction was, and this might have, in itself, might have persuaded Mr. Magellan otherwise, and that is a, what's the term? We'll have to find it again. I'm sorry. A gluttonous approach to inquiry. And I thought there are lots of wonderful turns of phrases here, but I just really like that one. So here's the other advertisement, and that's for the Friends of the APS. We have always been very, modest in encouraging folks to join the Friends, which costs money. But I will be, especially since this is my last opportunity to speak about the matter in public, I will say I do encourage you to join the Friends. Your financial contributions will support the Society's activities, and once you're a friend, you get invited to a number of good things to do in the course of the year. So it is not it's not friends without benefits. It's not friends with benefits, as they now use that term, but it's not friends without benefits. So I will also suggest that to you. There are brochures out there in the hallway to join about the Friends and what the costs and benefits are. And and I recommend you to take a look at those and join us. For those of you who are online, I almost hesitate to say this, but if you'd like to join the Friends, you may write to me by email. My email address is R as in Robert, M as in Mason, Hauser, Hauser, at our regular address, amphilsoc.org. AMPHIL dot, so no, AMPHILsoc.org. And with that, I will leave the podium. You may be really glad I'm leaving. To Michelle McDonald, who will do the honors here.
Good evening. I, for one, am looking forward to, he hasn't even seen it yet. He's still walking out. I, for one, am looking forward to tomorrow's directors meeting when I get to approach our director of development and say, have I got a slogan for you? All right, so I am, in fact, charged with introducing this evening's speaker, but I have a surprise, less of a surprise now first. Bob mentioned that this was his last evening introducing a program, a public program here for the APS, and so we wanted to commemorate that moment. So bear with me while we give you a few slides of Bob in review. Jeremy, do I have, I have the magic of the, okay, brilliant. 7.5, Bob in review after the colon, 7.5 years as executive officer of the American Philosophical Society. This is focused on the public programming aspect of your accomplishments, Bob. In the last 7.5 years, since 2017, you have provided over 60 public programs in this series. Go ahead, you can applaud. Tonight makes it 61. You have also, however, exponentially expanded that number through what we call Zoom, which was our APS virtual auditorium during the pandemic and remains, as those of you out in Zoom land, our hybrid auditorium. Those of you in Zoom land, I do have to say, however, you missed out on the wine and the nibbles. And I recognize that you may have wine and nibbles at home, but the biggest difference is you paid for yours and these people got it for free. Just something to, oh, good, applause, applause. Excellent, excellent. Speaking of nibbles, the impact of Bob on this public program series is measurable and demonstrable. We have had more than 7,000 attendees in person and online. We have sold over 1,000 books, and we hope to sell a few more this evening after that recommendation. We have had many, many celebratory toasts. We have many, many wedges of blue cheese, allegedly your favorite, Bob. We have many, many tiny bottles of water, and Jessica, I'm really not sure why we emphasize the water because that is not his beverage of choice, as anyone who knows Bob will tell you. And we have been purveyors of immeasurable, useful knowledge. Bob, we wanted to take a moment to salute you. This is Bob with his best friend, the Mastodon. I don't know if the Mastodon has a name. No, we'll just call it the Mastodon. So this is Bob the Mastodon. Bob, thank you for everything that you have done for this last 7.5 years to support public programming here at the APS. And here is the, wow, I'm taking a chance here, having only had seltzer. This is the audience interactive portion of the evening. Everybody, it's a short name. Do me a favor. Give me a B. B. Give me an O. O. Give me a B. B. And what does that spell? Bob. And who are we thanking this evening? Bob. That's right. Thank you, Bob. You didn't know that your director of the Library Museum spent 4 formative years as a cheerleader, did you? All right, now on to this evening's speaker. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion of Curious Species, which is a fantastic exploration of how 18th century scientists encountered and reacted to unfamiliar animals. In many of her examples, these are animals that are coming back from European voyages of exploration, some of which we now think of as quite familiar and even common, like rattlesnakes and raccoons, but which in the 18th century gaze were difficult to fit into the known world. And I will pause here and do a wee advertisement of my own, because the days are winding down. Today is December 10th, and I believe that our exhibition, Sketching Splendor, which is available and open to the public and focuses on natural history from 1750 to 1850, and also explores this idea of trying to understand the unknown, will only be on view through the end of this month. So, if you're interested in this kind of history, I encourage you to see that exhibition before it closes. Now, these animals in her books and the questions that they raised, they challenged scientists' efforts to master nature during the Enlightenment, at a time when rigid classification pervaded the study of natural history. What Whitney Barlow Robles does is bring these animals to life in a different kind of book in which they are as much the protagonist as the subject of what she is studying. And she takes us on on 4 journeys through the ocean, the underground, the cabinet of curiosity, and the field. She got this training to do this kind of work through an interesting academic path. She has her AM in history from Harvard, her BA in American Studies with a concentration in nature writing from Yale, and is currently a visiting scholar in the Department of History at Dartmouth. I took a look at her CV, and her work has been supported by a prodigious number of institutions, including the American Historical Association, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the American Antiquarian Society, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. And if you wondered why the American Philosophical Society was not among that number, it was not for lack of trying. I believe we did extend you a fellowship offer, but you had an even stronger fellowship offer. And let me tell you, this is half of what I could have read. At the end says, among other institutions. Please join me in welcoming Whitney to the podium.
All right, good evening, everyone. All right, looks like that's working. Thank you so much for being here for this evening hour, and thanks to people for being online on Zoom. I am going to be introducing you to my book, Curious Species. In short, it's a book about the animal foundations of knowledge, both in that we as human beings are never not writing or working or thinking or knowing as animals, but primarily because non-human animals have long put significant checks on human understanding. And this was perhaps never clearer than during the 18th century, the golden age of curiosity, and a moment when natural history coalesced into a formalized discipline through the rise of museums, taxonomy, and Linnaean nomenclature. In some ways, the world of 18th century natural history seems a distant leap from the one we inhabit today. I want you to picture your living space at home. Then look at this 1775 portrait of the Dutch naturalist Laurens Gronovius, sitting in his study with his 2 sons, the very picture of an enlightened Enlightenment naturalist. Are there jarred specimens at your disposal? If you're a scientist, maybe. But what about a microscope wrapped in stingray skin on the mantle? Could you show guests the wonders of electricity by cranking a tabletop device? What secrets do your cabinets hold? Is there a coral or maybe a bezoar in the drawer? Have you dressed your son in a fantastic gown? And if he's still in diapers, ask yourself, why not? You could explain away these trappings as a matter of privilege and power, and surely this man was well-to-do, inheriting wealth and expanding upon a collection passed down from his own naturalist father. And many a modern tycoon accumulates. Take, for example, the famed collection of Fabergé eggs collected by Victor Vekselberg. But not even Elon Musk, the oddest of the odd billionaires of our own times, has a pickled siren. This painting was finished a year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Look closely, and that spinning globe next to Cronovius shows the New World with no United States as we know it now, but instead a North America carved up among warring empires. Curious Species takes apart this world. Readers will open its cabinets and touch the specimens inside, unseal its jars to count the scales and fins, flip through the pages of its books and manuscripts, try to feel something of the bodily pain delivered by some of its creatures, and hear whispers of revolution from its animal protagonists. Animals creep along the margins of history and the fringes of documents, present but often undetected, influential yet unacknowledged. They linger beneath history's surface, sometimes materializing for just a moment, in a sidelong comment about wolves in colonial records, through a skin they've shed that made its way to a museum, as the leather binding of a book, or by staring back from a picture. And although this book started out as simply a history of animals and 18th century science, the animals had other plans for me, so to speak. I began to talk to modern-day practitioners of natural history, initially just out of curiosity for additional context. But in doing that, I soon realized that there was something stubbornly unresolved about what happened to human-animal relations in the Enlightenment and the kind of disenchantment and attempted severing of the human and animal worlds that took place, which still bears on the truly existential plight that some of these species are facing now. And it was probably around the time I had my finger in the mouth of the world's rarest raccoon that I realized, well, maybe I wouldn't be getting out of this book as a character either, as one of the latest in a long line of curious species. Animals powerfully affected 18th century natural history. They guide the work of modern biologists. So is it any wonder they would change my approach? These little field encounters soon became roughly half of the book, whose chapters now alternate between historical deep dives into the histories of particular animals and present-day narratives. And the latter are something that I call narrative breaches in both senses of the term. A coming up for air from a submerged history to the surface of the present, and also a transgression in the traditional format of historical writing. These breaches play a few roles. One is a matter of historical argument and content. 18th century natural history, I argue, created this impasse about the knowability of animals that continues to shape our relationship with the descendants of these creatures today, requiring an interweaving of past and present if we wish to reckon with their uncertain futures. Take corals, for example. It wasn't until the middle of the 18th century that corals were agreed upon by naturalists to be animals, not plants, not stones. Yet they were still seen as the lowest, least perfect animals in creation. At the same time, they built these reefs that could and did send ships to watery graves. By traveling to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia, which is something I narrate in the book, I was able to witness firsthand how climate change has devastated and bleached the very same stalwart reef that nearly took down Captain Cook's Endeavour voyage in 1770, stranding the crew for weeks. Venturing into the present helps us see the enduring paradoxes of this creature that's both somehow minuscule and massive, theoretically immortal, yet supremely delicate, bedeviled by global warming, and yet a survivor of past mass extinction events. An animal, and yet a home to plant-like algal symbionts within their tissues. Another reason this book wanders into the present is a matter of historical method. The lives of other animals are hard enough to fathom when they're right in front of us. To access the fragmentary stories of bygone animals, we have to turn to tools outside the usual parameters of historical archival evidence. reenactment, embodied experience, literary devices, and engagement with contemporary scientific literature can offer multiple entries into a non-human animal's sensorium and world, however limited this picture might be. Animals, in short, ask historians to write differently. So that's why in one section of the book, I reenact 18th century fish flattening instructions, which was a very common method of preserving fish, to witness firsthand the post-mortem resistance of animal bodies when it comes to matters of material and artistic representation. This enduring problem of how do you fix evanescent life to a page. Finally, a first-person perspective can also more fully encompass the human practice of the study of nature. One thing has held steady in some form since the 18th century. Our dealings with animals are deeply personal. Enlightenment naturalists employed what we might now call subjective methods. Their accounts of animals were intimate, anecdotal, and emotional. This was perhaps never more apparent than in the case of the early modern study of raccoons, and never more apparent to me than in my encounter with the world's rarest raccoon, the dwarf Cozumel raccoon, off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Humanoid raccoons were famous for the use of their hands to understand their worlds in the 18th century, something that naturalists studied by having pet raccoons. So on this slide, there's a picture of the Swedish juggernaut Carl Linnaeus's own pet raccoon named Shop. Getting high-fived by this critically endangered animal, this bizarre mixture of extreme rarity and extreme familiarity, almost casualness, gave me a truly intimate foray into the past and an intimate look at the literal face of extinction and biodiversity loss today, as the IUCN most recently estimated that the number of wild, mature pygmy raccoons might be under 200 individuals. And this picture was not in a park or a zoo or any sort of curated wildlife experience, by the way. So in the 18th century, naturalists didn't study animals at arm's length. They lived with, mourned over, touched, smelled, ate, dreamt about, and delivered the babies of their animal subjects to learn more about them. They reported their feeling-filled findings in scientific journals and other formal and distinguished venues. People could delight in not knowing, and many did quite unreasonable things in this self-described age of reason. The modern idea, writes Megan Roberts, of science as a purely rational, detached exercise was nowhere to be found in early empiricism. So she says in Sentimental Savants, a study of how French Enlightenment scientists established their credibility through emotion, passion, and sentiment, especially by incorporating their families into their research agendas. As you'll soon see, I've taken a page from them on that last point. Indeed, we no longer have, if we ever did, the luxury of extracting ourselves from the matter. Over the past 3 centuries, human beings, though unequally so, have created the catastrophes of climate change and environmental loss, driving countless animals closer to extinction. So this book splices the genres of history and natural history with the hope of troubling them both. Historians are a lot like pigs. This is actually a huge compliment coming from me. They're intelligent and formidable. Their memories really stick. They travel in packs and zealously defend their young, their protégés. When rooting around for things beneath the surface, they leave no stone or piece of evidence unturned. But there's also a tradition other than academic history that I'm drawing from in this book: nature and science writing. These practitioners, on the other hand, might be said to be more like bees. They generate buzz. Some are specialists, some are generalists. They too form a community. They gather nectar from many sources and transmute it into something that's more than the sum of its parts. This book, then, is a hybrid monster, born of 2 genealogies. It is, in short, my attempt to make pigs fly. And for all of the justified hand-wringing about AI these days, I quite like what Midjourney did with this terrifying pig here. So with all of that background in mind, I want to more fully introduce you to this book by spending the remainder of our time with a particular case study that I haven't mentioned yet. Rattlesnakes. You love them or you hate them. And statistically speaking, a good portion of you out there probably hate them. But maybe by the time we're done tonight, I'll have one or two snake converts in the audience. Now, primarily, I'm going to be speaking about the present day, that so-called narrative breach. But before we get there, we need some very brief historical background first. Rattlesnakes have been persecuted by humans since the early modern period, purged as obstacles by colonial invaders, feared as biblical symbols, and collected as sexual curiosities because they give birth to live young. In 1712, Cotton Mather described how wiping out rattlesnake dens was an actual militia training ritual in colonial Massachusetts. Naturalists viewed rattlesnakes as a singular threat to natural history because they repelled the fearful naturalists' gaze so viscerally. And writers like Oliver Goldsmith found them to be singular colonial deterrents as well. He branded all snakes as, quote, sentinels to deter mankind from spreading too widely. Due to systematic destruction of den sites from the 17th century onward, timber rattlesnakes, species named Crotalus horridus, are now considered locally endangered or extinct throughout New England, Canada, and other regions. These areas were once vibrant reptilian soundscapes. Early settlers and native people hesitated to go out in rain for fear of the din drowning out the rattlesnake's warning. But these lands now sit eerily quiet, even as they remain dotted with rattlesnake toponyms from settlers. There's much more historical background in the book, and the Sketching Splendor exhibition here at the APS has some really wonderful material on rattlesnakes in the 18th and early 19th centuries, so I would urge you once again to check that out if you've not. But I think with that preamble in mind, we can get into the weeds quite literally. Timber rattlesnakes are the most critically endangered animals in New Hampshire, which was my place of residence at the time I wrote this. Only one known population remains in the entire state. As a result, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department keeps the whereabouts of these rare creatures a virtual state secret, even to most of their employees. They scrub the lone den's location from maps and official documentation and police physical access to it due to ongoing threats from poachers, but also threats from the merely curious. Folks seeking to observe these rattlesnakes either for their extreme rarity or for the unique black coloration of this particular community can still cause the community distress and unintentionally expose the site's whereabouts to those with ill intent. I was therefore quite lucky to be permitted to follow a wildlife biologist named Brendan Clifford, one of the state's appointed silent caretakers to the serpent's subterranean lair. When I first spoke with him over the phone, I learned he'd been monitoring this population for nearly 15 years by tracking their seasonal movements, recording the ebb and flow of their births and deaths, observing the ravages of a fungal disease plaguing the population, and rehabilitating injured and sick snakes. His tenderness towards these animals sat in contrast to many 18th century naturalists who avoided rattlesnakes. Some said they literally preferred not to know them, not to study them. And in contrast to 18th century settlers, some of whom set out to try to annihilate the species quite deliberately. Brendan surmised that for some of the serpents in this isolated community, he was the sole human they'd ever seen. Since Europeans first invaded this landscape, the ancestral and never-ceded homelands of Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples, rattlesnakes have had targets on their backs. Current secrecy efforts help guard the animals from an extermination ethos shared by many early settlers. The belief in a God-ordained duty to kill rattlesnakes as a satanic stain on an Edenic landscape. One contemporary nature writer, I learned, had already been blacklisted in herpetology circles for not taking sufficient care on the printed page to keep the whereabouts of this and other dens untraceable. But despite the profession's unease with authors, after our phone call, Brendan's supervisor, for whatever reason, gave me permission to follow Brendan to the hibernaculum. But to see these secretive animals, we were beholden to their own schedule and rhythms. We counted down the days until warmer weather would coax the vipers en masse from their winter hideaway, many fathoms deep in dark fissures of rock underground. We waited, and we waited. Once the snakes emerged from the hibernaculum, they would bask in the sun to raise their body temperature and then disperse miles into the woods for their short summer window of Turanian activity. Postpartum mothers who'd given birth to litters of live young the previous year would continue the slow labor of rebuilding their fat stores after their resource-intensive pregnancies. And those females in the population who had mated in a dance of intertwined tails last autumn, who had been holding and quietly tending sperm in their bodies all winter long, would now begin their formal gestation at the very moment we sought them. Only, as luck would have it, this particular year was 2020. Our snake community's springtime exit happened to coincide with the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. On account of the strict lockdown, I assumed that our expedition would be delayed indefinitely. But despite the virus raging around us, care of these endangered animals was deemed essential state business. When I told my friend Charlotte about the upcoming trip, she asked an offhanded question that I couldn't shake from my mind. What's more dangerous, a stranger in a mask or a mama rattlesnake? The mama rattlesnake, I thought to myself without hesitating. But perhaps not for the reason you might answer the same. I feared a masked stranger, but I had faint premonitions of what a mother was capable of, for I too was pregnant. I virtually hadn't left the house in months, aside from scaled-back prenatal visits to the hospital. My photo reel began to feel like Groundhog Day. Homemade bread, masks, a small perimeter around the house, a maternity photo shoot on the porch with my cat, a nursery full of baby items only ever seen online. Faced with the prospect of venturing into a semi-apocalyptic world to root around for a potentially lethal animal across steep terrain, with a creature in my body I was determined to care for, and as I saw from the updating weather report, all during a massive heat wave, I began to feel some apprehension. I debated whether to reveal my pregnancy to Brendan in advance for fear I would be banned from seeing the den, my state of being too much of a risk for the state of New Hampshire. And then when I decided to tell him and he was happy to proceed, I felt trepidation that this trip was actually going to happen, only days before I would enter the turbulent third trimester as my lungs started to lose precious capacity and my abdomen and sense of balance grew yet more unwieldy. Would I react like William Bartram, I wondered, who, when faced with one rattlesnake in the 18th century, felt, quote, so shocked with surprise and horror as to be in a manner riveted to the spot, for a short time not having strength to go away. Before I left in search of snakes, my father-in-law, Guillermo, offered a bit of family lore, something we call a Robles story. A woman who worked at the ranch and general store of Guillermo's grandfather in Veracruz, which is nestled along Mexico's Gulf Coast, also encountered a rattlesnake as an expecting mother. Early one morning, while she milked a cow in the semi-dawn, a serpent hiding behind the livestock struck out from the shadows and envenomed her leg. The woman cried out in pain, only to find, to her surprise, that the rattlesnake died instantly and collapsed in a limp spiral at her feet. A physician was called to the ranch to treat the woman, but when he arrived, he told her not to fear. He insisted that the forces of vitality flowing through her body from the pregnancy had simultaneously killed the serpent and protected her unborn child. He assured her there is nothing more poisonous than a pregnant woman. After a grueling labor several months later, she gave birth to a baby who was unscathed. And out with the child popped a tidy sealed sack of rattlesnake venom. The morning of our journey, I found my husband, William, already on the couch downstairs. He'd woken hours before me due to a serpentine knot of nerves in his stomach, which he hoped either to ease or exacerbate by watching videos of timber rattlesnakes, looking for some sign that these beings would not harm his wife or child. Brendan had given William permission to join the excursion since since social distancing requirements made Brendan unable to help a substantially pregnant woman scale a cliffside. As we started driving, our car's thermometer soon hit 95 degrees, highly unusual for a New Hampshire morning in late May, or at least it was unusual back then. It was yet another reminder of our tinderbox of a world which seemed ready to ignite on all sides, from fires and pandemics and melting permafrost and police brutality, as protests over George Floyd's murder would erupt in just a couple of days, his body not yet laid to rest beside his mother inside the earth. The trees on distant hillsides shimmered sickly from the heat's haze. I crammed our hiking bags with as much water and Gatorade as would fit, knowing we wouldn't be able to stop at so much as a gas station to use the restroom, thanks to the virus's insidious hold on potentially any indoor space. We drove to a location I cannot speak of, past trees whose nomenclature I should not name, leaped as much as the gestating can leap, across rocks whose form and geologic history must go unsaid. Although the rocks, I will note, were towering and magnificent, ancient wardens sheltering legless spirits and stony wombs. But there are other things I can't tell you. We initially greeted Brendan from afar in a parking lot. He asked us to follow his vehicle, which made strategically confusing twists and turns to the undisclosed location. As we began our hike, all wearing snake gaiters, which gave bite protection from ankle to knee, Brendan told us that this sheltered and fragmented population in New Hampshire bears so little ill will toward the foreign form we call the human that they don't typically even rattle when he approaches. I had daydreamed that we would find the rattlesnakes emerging together from the rocks, their remarkable reptilian social structure on view. Herpetologists have only recently started to appreciate what they call the cryptic sociality of rattlesnakes in the past 2 decades or so, although native people were already well aware of this in the 18th century, as with a Cherokee man named Blanket, who voyaged to the serpent underworld and witnessed an emotional rattlesnake funeral, something that I narrate in more detail in the book. In fact, rattlesnakes survived the slaughters of the 18th century, in part because native people often systematically hid the whereabouts of snake dens from settlers and shielded the animals from violence. Biologists now accept that female rattlesnakes recognize and cuddle with their sisters after years of separation, for instance. However, once we reached their stone stronghold, we realized the snakes had beaten us to the punch. Already dispersed into the woods, they likely would not return to the den until later in the fall, or in the case of pregnant females, a bit sooner to begin a gestational sun vigil together. These snakes were not the writhing spectacle of vulnerability that I expected to find, which had so exposed them to settler predation in early America. In fact, tracking devices that had been affixed to 4 females provided the only clues to the existence of any snakes at all in these woods. Brendan's team had placed radio transmitters either directly onto their rattles with glue or more invasively through surgical insertion at a veterinarian's office. Each snake had her own FM wavelength, and to track her down, Brendan would hoist this giant metal antenna above his head and follow a steady beeping that intensified as we ranged closer. As we moved deeper into the forest, I felt not fear, but a surprising alertness and calm. I silently repeated a mantra that would carry me through this miles-long search, over and through bramble, steep cliffs, slippery leaves, and mosquito clouds to meet the one I sought, a mantra I would repeat again just a few months later during my own labor. There's nothing more poisonous than a pregnant woman. The rattlesnakes and I, we'd all been waiting. Life had felt paused, dormant, latent, on hold. Timber rattlesnakes near the northern limit of their range in New Hampshire spend the majority of every year underground, deep below the frost line. Many female rattlesnakes spend these dim subterranean months readying themselves for a spring and summer gestation. In summer, pregnant females join together as if to form one mass, enveloped in each other's coils and folds while exposed on sun-soaked slabs of rock near their maternal den. In late August or early September, these females will give birth to reptilian replicas in miniature, as the surrounding treetops burst into fireworks of redback salamander and burnt orange. The very same season when I would be due to deliver a daughter. So while this community of snakes had been waiting underground, at the same time I was waiting out a biological and cultural winter of my own. In early March of 2020, I retreated into my own den, into my own self for lockdown, all while tuning my senses to the small life growing within. And then March became April, became May. Time twined, knotted, rolled over itself and concealed its true shape. I felt my child's first tadpole twitches in this state of suspended animation. Early modern women called a fetus's initial perceptible taps quickening. Pregnancy wasn't the worst time to slow down and simply be, for those like myself with the tremendous privilege to afford stasis in that pandemic moment. I was curled up, becoming, snake-like in my incubation, expecting, expectant, waiting for things not yet seen. And yet, the early season of this pandemic was a trying time to be with child. To have little choice about bringing new life into a major historical event, as I was already pregnant when lockdown began, and soon realized my daughter would enter a world that was quite different from the one she was planned in. To know in your mammal gut and from basic logic that gestation put you at a higher risk of severe illness and death, only to be dismissed by doctors and federal agencies until the needed data vindicated you long after it mattered. To wonder at that time if a vaccine would ever materialize. To flee at the sight of people, given the very real consequence should you or your partner be infected of birthing a baby alone. A baby that would then be whisked away from you for days or weeks under hospital protocol. To miss out on any sense of normalcy before such a metamorphosis in one's life. All this to emerge and suddenly find that the village you were promised is empty. Scientists do not typically describe rattlesnakes or other reptiles as pregnant. Instead, they are termed gravid, from the Latin gravis, meaning burdened or heavy. This word initially struck me as more clinical, less human, an attempted bulwark against anthropomorphism. It was not until I became pregnant myself that I would realize just how clinical and yet human it could be. When reviewing my medical records, I noticed the label G1P0 on every document. G to denote gravidity, the number of times a person has entered this state of burden and heaviness. And P is for parity, defined in the US as the number of previous pregnancies that made it past 20 weeks. Interacting with the medical establishment quite literally makes pregnant people into gravid specimens. The violence of that association has always been truest for people of color, stretching back to the abuses of enslaved women as research subjects of early obstetrics, and lingering into the present with stark racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality rates. In the 18th century, naturalists feverishly quantified every aspect of the specimens they collected, and this was especially true when it came to matters reproductive. In possession of a dead rattlesnake, they would count the number of joints in its rattle, measure the snake's length and girth, tally up its total number of scales, which is really hard to do. And in the case of a gravid female, they would typically slice open the abdomen and account for the offspring inside. Each prenatal checkup, I would lie down, exposed like a curiosity, while a doctor, midwife, or more typically a resident in training calculated the size of my growing uterus with a tape measure. They rarely referred to me by name anymore. I was suddenly Mom. Medics and masks logged each pound I gained, pondered every blood pressure reading. I almost thought I fooled them when my apparently non-binary blood type went undiagnosable for months, until they found a term for that too. Once I started experiencing heart palpitations from the increased blood flow of pregnancy, a cardiologist fastened electrodes across my chest and ribs, which he connected by wires to a device that monitored my internal rhythms for several days, making me feel not unlike a radio-tagged snake. During labor, I would be strapped with monitors again to chart the thump-thump of my baby's heartbeat and the crescendos of each contraction. Birthing at a university hospital, I was quite literally a pedagogical specimen, like many an early modern snake. Accommodating, pliant, compliant, and female, my body was a teaching moment. One blunder by an unsupervised resident would have become life-threatening had I not noticed it. My baby as well became an object of study and a specimen to track, her early weeks marked by an obsession over pounds, ounces, minutes of milk, inches from head to toe, centimeters of head circumference. When I first saw her on this side of existence, well, there are still things I must keep from you. Vulnerability has always attended being pregnant, writes historian Sarah Knott in Mother is a Verb. Projections of vulnerability on the visibly pregnant too, she adds. Both rattlesnake bodies and pregnant human bodies have been viewed through a lens of danger, one capable of inflicting, the other of receiving. But vulnerability cuts all ways. Historically and now, gravid females have been the most exposed snakes in any timber rattlesnake community, as pregnancy prompts them to bask conspicuously on rocks, heavy with young that distend their bellies and spread their scales. In distinction to a human pregnancy, they'll also forego food during gestation and eventually lose around a third of their body weight, which takes years to regain. These snake matriarchs guard the next generation, too. After giving birth, the assembly of basking mothers will stay by the sides of their vulnerable newborns and protect them for a week or longer, until propelled by hunger into the forest for that first precious postpartum meal. Rattlesnakes have their village. Familial affection and ties of kin in the reptile world have often been hard for scientists to see, although they've always been there. Take the small carnivorous dinosaur known as Oviraptor, whose name translates to egg thief. Ever since this dinosaur's discovery in the 1920s, when a fossil uncovered in Mongolia showed an adult specimen hovering over a clutch of oblong eggs, paleontologists assumed the dinosaur was scavenging the eggs right when catastrophe hit and preserved them all in a prehistoric snapshot. It took around half a century for scientists to realize the dinosaur was in fact sitting on the eggs, protecting them, cradling its babies as its last dying wish. Many dinosaurs, the kin of modern birds, parented just like birds do. In fact, modern birds probably parent because the practice existed among ancient dinosaurs, birds simply being those dinosaurs who averted extinction. As with the terrible lizards, it has similarly taken some time, retraining, and mental openness for scientists to appreciate rattlesnakes not as unemotive killers and loners, but as parents, too. Mothering as not just warm and soft, but also cold, scaly, and hard. A mile into the woods, we were surrounded by female rattlesnakes, assured by the beep, beep, beep at every frequency of Brendan's radio. One we determined had found refuge somewhere in a nearly vertical cliff wall, which dropped beneath our toes many dozens of feet. Knowing the terrain, Brendan could tell that a second rattlesnake had traveled across a dense marsh that would be quite difficult to maneuver, and a third was just too far. Trying to find these snakes would have been dangerous on this oppressively hot day. One lone signal, however, held out an electric promise. It hailed from a direction that, though deep in the forest, wasn't filled with cliffs or marshes, according to Brendan. We put our faith in this sound, and in her direction we went, eager to find this subtle serpent, not so subtle antenna hoisted overhead. After what seemed like an eternity, Brendan pointed his apparatus at a fallen tree and an adjacent patch of bramble, and I knew from his body language that we had found her. We approached slowly, reverentially. She was as unmovable as a mound of brain coral. The serpent's gaze almost seemed to narrow at us, an artifact of a rattlesnake's supraocular scales, which create a permanent hood above each eye. Without the aid of technology, we likely never would have found this statuesque snake. She was a lighter charcoal color than most of her kin out here, her hallmark banding pattern faintly visible like veins in marble. Brendan estimated that she was 4 feet long when fully extended and that she could strike about half the length of her body from this pose. We stayed more than a couple of feet back. Brendan recognized her as a postpartum female who'd given birth to at least 6 live young the previous fall. She was still at the beginning of the long journey of a mother's recovery, not to give birth again for several more autumns. The offspring she'd sheltered and cared for, alongside other basking mothers and their young, were now out in the woods as well. Brendan described her as confident. She barely budged when we approached, assured of her own power. I wondered if she may have also been afraid. She was one of the snakes who'd been radio tagged through surgical means. Brendan found a long stick and used it to lightly lift the veil of bramble covering the serpent's face, allowing for this better photo op. She made no sound at the stick's approach, demurring even to reveal her eponymous rattle, let alone shake it in alarm or defense. William said she had the air of a grandmother, putting him at immediate ease. He told me later he felt a desire to move closer, an urge he suppressed out of deference for both biologist and snake. I, too, felt a magnetic force, similar to what one 18th century Vermonter named Elias Willard experienced. Initially planning to kill a rattlesnake he encountered, Willard wrote that, quote, "My curiosity led me to view him. While I forcibly dragged off my body, my head seemed to be irresistibly drawn to the enchanter by an invisible power." The notion that snakes, and especially rattlesnakes, could enchant prey and people was remarkably widespread in the 18th century. And it seems enchantment is one of these truly unresolved corners of the early study of rattlesnakes. In fact, the Quaker naturalist John Bartram, father to William, wrote of buffaloes, beavers, and rattlesnakes in 1772, quote, "If they are so continually destroyed for a century to come as they have been for the last 50 years, there will be but few left, and the story of a rattlesnake and its fascinating power, or enchanting power, will be in a few hundred years as little credited as the cockatrice, a legendary serpent, killing at a distance by its eyes." Bartram was right. The early modern period saw a much richer body of theorization about possible causes and meanings of snake enchantment than scientists and really most historians would dare seriously entertain today. But people were enchanted by rattlesnakes at some level. If herpetologists of the past few decades are just now catching up to early native observers in their recognition of rattlesnake sociality and kinship, what else might modern science be missing or dismissing from the centuries past corpus of snake knowledge? There are still things we don't understand about the sway animals have over us. Brendan gently lowered the bramble over the serpent's face again, leaving her as obscured as we'd found her. And that was that. Our encounter had to be brief, by design. Lingering any longer might have perturbed her. "We don't want to distress endangered species," Brendan said. That we could only find one rattlesnake made sense in retrospect. Her singularity was compelling, a reminder of unseen worlds underfoot, of gestations best left hidden from human view, and more solemnly of vastly diminished snake numbers in the region. We didn't see a single human soul on our adventure, perhaps for the better. I wondered if this snake had any inklings of the storms of the human world raging around her. If the pandemic retreat of people into homes had coaxed her and the 3 others to venture farther, wider, wilder than before. In the minds of Brendan and his colleagues, their task wasn't simply a matter of ensuring people don't find the site. They saw victory not only in humans losing some knowledge of rattlesnakes, but also in rattlesnakes losing some knowledge of humans, too. But remove human bodies from the den of the snakes, if you can or if you should, and the tentacles of climate change can still find their way in, evident from that fungal disease plaguing this particular population, which researchers believe is thanks to warmer winters and wetter springs. Looking back into the green hush of the woods, hand on the growing orb of my belly, I wanted to ask that snake a question I've been quietly mulling for months. How do you mother when the world is burning? Thank you.
We'll take a few questions.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have an odd question. So you spoke a lot about the view of rattlesnakes, especially by Europeans, et cetera, who come to this country as bad, evil, dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, in the 18th century, the rattlesnake is a metaphor for America. Benjamin Franklin uses it in the Join or Die cartoon, where the emphasis is certainly join, not die. It appears on the Gadsden flag. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to sort of this juxtaposition between rattlesnake as, you know, icon of America and rattlesnake as something that needs to be destroyed.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an excellent question. And it's something I look at in the book. I think that, so a lot of historians have written about rattlesnakes, but they really only looked at that imagery. That imagery is so powerful from this colonial period. And so something I argue is that an emphasis on that symbol, which is so powerful, has overshadowed the animal itself. I think part of the reason that rattlesnakes were an effective symbol was because they were formidable and feared, right? So you particularly see that with the Gadsden flag, for example. And if you look at Native communities at this time, they're also putting rattlesnake tattoos on their arms. They're putting rattlesnakes on, carving them into trees as a kind of warning to other Native nations. So it's a powerful symbol across cultural lines. Fun fact, too, is if you look at the Join or Die image, initially used as a bid for colonial unity at the outset of the 7 Years' War, and if you look at the Gadsden flag, those are actually the two different scientific natural history illustration techniques for how do you fit this really long animal on a page. You can kind of scrunch it up into low amplitude waves like Join or Die, or you can coil it like on the Gadsden flag. And it's further complicated in a way too by the fact that among animals, rattlesnakes are perhaps the most symbolic and semiotic. They have this device that one biologist has called the most novel appendage in the animal kingdom. And so they can literally make a kind of symbol in a way to communicate with other beings. So they're such a potently rich animal symbolically. But yes, there absolutely is this really interesting dichotomy there. Thank you so much.
Thank you also it was a wonderful talk. Let me add my thanks. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit about your choice of these four. So I know you in your introduction, you talk about what they have in common, what they represent, how they allow you to go into different areas, different biogeographies, but lots of animals could have taken you into those different biogeographies. So why those four?
Yeah. And I think part of the answer is you could write this book about four totally different animals. So I had a few different considerations when I was choosing the animals. I wanted a mix of animals like rattlesnakes that were kind of well known, but still the animals themselves were kind of poorly understood both to scientists and in the historiography. So things like rattlesnakes and actually corals to an extent fill that role. Things like the fish flattening and raccoons, not a lot of people have looked at, so I wanted some newer material in there as well. Also, raccoons are just fun, like they're a crowd pleaser. So the kind of larger superstructure of the book that I haven't mentioned yet is there was this notion dating back to antiquity that reaches its apotheosis really in the 18th century, something called the Great Chain of Being, or the Scala Naturae. And it was this literal ordering of all of the matter in the universe. And so within animals, I sort of proceed up through that. So corals are right sort of on the border with plants. As I mentioned, they're the least perfect animals. So they're the lowest animals in the minds of many naturalists in this hierarchy. Snakes aren't all that much higher above them. You know, they're literally on the ground, on their bellies. Fish have this sort of middling, almost unremarkable station on the chain of being. And then animals like raccoons, Also, you could look at chimpanzees at this time, dogs, lions were seen as, some of the most regal animals. They're often the first animal listed in a bestiary, which is a mark of the animal's importance. Those mammals are a lot closer to human beings. And so I go through this hierarchy of the chain of being in the book structure, not to say that we should follow this hierarchy or kind of reify it or endorse it, but to try to take it apart from within and steep ourselves in the worldviews of 18th century people, while also seeing how the lowest animal on the hierarchy actually makes the largest animal structures in the world, coral reefs, and arguably had the largest impact on humans in that they were literally, almost killed Captain Cook. Like that's a really big deal. But yeah, I think so there are certainly other animals that come up throughout the course of the book as well, but I think you could do a similar analysis with other animals too. Thank you.
Follow-up question, did your visit to these animals count as research trips? Do you get to count those as research trips?
In what sense?
Like financially, did you get to count them as research trips?
Financially, it depends. So Australia, Harvard, where I did my graduate work, has a pot of Australia money. So that was the only reason that I was able to afford to go to the Great Barrier Reef and charter a boat to go. I literally had to talk to a bunch of different people, kept getting the response, you're gonna need a bigger boat, and was finally able to find this wonderful guy, John Corbett, who took me out to see that reef. So that was definitely, could not have been possible without that funding. The rattlesnake voyage was just in driving distance, and the fish flattening that I did, I literally just got the fish at the grocery store. And the raccoons, now that I come to think of it, that was just as my in-laws used to live in Mexico, and so we were there, and I was like, I have to see the Cozumel raccoon. So it was just the coral trip that was like a formally funded research trip. That was a good one. Yeah, it was great.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It is such a pleasure to hear about your work, to see your book come out, and to listen to your storytelling, which, as usual, is spectacular. I was so struck by the way you expertly intertwined, right, the story of curiosity that tells a story of not just what motivates it, but what the consequences of curiosity are. You made me empathize with both the subjects and objects of curiosity. And large part of that is due to not just your methodologically distinct research trips, in addition to your archival work, but also your storytelling of your pregnancy and of giving birth, which, my intuition is that it is extremely courageous for you to do that. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to be explicit about the courage that it takes to do that. What sort of breach, pardon the pun, is this? How is it important to remind us that historians are mothers too?
Oh, thank you. And I'm going to embarrass Grace and say she has been there for the genesis of so much of this project. We used to meet, so she did her graduate work at MIT. I was at Harvard. We met at this conference that Harriet Ripo had organized and became close friends. And we read, I think, every chapter of the other's dissertation and talked about them over coffee. This actually was not in my dissertation. This is probably new material to you. Yeah, the pregnancy, it is a little scary to put that out there. But, I was approaching it in a few different ways. I think rattlesnakes have been so demonized that I thought drawing the analogy with humans, not to anthropomorphize them, but to see the animal and the human as much as one might look for supposedly human traits in animals. I thought that bringing in the personal element was a way to redeem them in a sense. I also, maybe from a more selfish perspective, felt like being pregnant at that early pandemic moment was something, as a historian, that I wanted to codify on paper as an experience that people went through. A lot of people had it very bad and literally had to give birth totally alone. Some people died, pregnant women who didn't get the appropriate care. There are documented cases of that happening during COVID. So I wanted to make sure that that didn't slip away from historical memory. It's interesting, I think people don't want to think about the pandemic. We're all kind of like collectively traumatized by it, perhaps. We all had different experiences of it, but I think we also had a shared experience. Part of this was excerpted in Slate, and it was interesting talking to the editor. She was like, our readers really hate COVID stories. So I kind of knew that going in, but it is interesting. And I mean, I'm inspired by Sarah Knott's work. Her book, Mother is a Verb, is so incredible. I can't recommend it enough. This like seemingly universal human experience, everyone in this room is a product of a human pregnancy. So I think that is reason enough to search into it, but she also looks at how the experience of pregnancy is so different across time and space as well. So this is only one kind of particular moment of it, but I do think that, you know, the personal is political in a sense, and we as historians are just people at the end of the day. And so I'm very much an advocate of injecting some of our own subjectivity into historical writing. So thank you.
I think that's all. Oh, Bob, I'll give you your last one.
Yeah, in one of the parts of the book that I have been able to read so far, you went on at length about the word curious, both historically and as you use it. And I think it might be interesting to folks here if you were to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, curious is a curious word because in the 18th century, this is true now, but it was, you know, really apparent to readers in the 18th century that a curiosity could be something that you experienced as a subject. You could be curious about animals, about natural history, about other people, but a curiosity was also a thing, an object of study. And so there really is a slippage between subject and object that's inherent in that word. And so, of course, the title of the book, Curious Species, it's intentionally vague. Does that refer to humans? Does that refer to animals? At the end of the day, it refers to both. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.